Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. According to the Brookings Institution, quote, the next 30 years are going to be pivotal for the future of the global climate. To have a fighting chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees, a threshold beyond which the Earth may not be able to sustain human life, we need reductions in the range of 25 to 55% of cumulative global emissions by 2050. To put that in perspective, that basically means we've got to cut the world's carbon output in half in the next 30 years. And while electric cars may be part of the solution, they're not going to get us to where we need to go. In short, many are beginning to realize that we need an all-of-the-above strategy. Indeed, our guest has written that, quote, while the world is focused on renewables and electrification, that will not be enough. We need to actively decarbonize the atmosphere. In short, carbon capture. We're fortunate to have as our guest the nation's foremost authority on carbon capture and the author of a recent report entitled Getting to Neutral, Options for Negative Carbon Emissions in California. He is Roger Aines, the Energy Program Chief Scientist at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you very much.
So California's got this very ambitious goal of being carbon neutral by 2045. How much carbon would we have to remove in California each year to hit this target? Is our current strategy going to get us there? And if not, how short are we going to be?
Well, you have to split that into 2 components. There's the stuff that we want to stop emitting. That's about 300 or 350 million tons a year in that vicinity. And that's, electrifying cars, changing industry out to non-fossil fuels. And then the remainder, we'll just have to remove from the atmosphere because it's relatively small sources or things that we can't get rid of. And that'll be on the order of about 100 million tons per year.
So we're talking about an awful lot here. So this other tool in the greenhouse gas reduction toolbox is what you refer to as negative emissions. Can you explain what negative emissions are?
Well, that's the nerd's term for removing CO2 from the air. And we call it negative emissions because it's all about the math of adding up the total and have it get to 0. And so you have a negative number and you add it to the positive number that we're already doing, and the 2 cancel each other out. But realistically, what it means is we have to remove carbon that's already in the atmosphere because it's essentially there permanently. There's very little that will change it over human lifetimes.
And removing it has some additional benefits, right? Air quality, et cetera.
Absolutely. And anything you do to reduce overall pollution is going to be good for the planet. But the CO2, the real challenge there is that you can't see it, that it's insidious. And we've been throwing it in the air, throwing our trash in the air for human history. And we don't throw our solid trash in the street. We shouldn't throw our CO2 into the air either.
Yeah, we also have, there's a lot of challenges to this, right? Transportation, agriculture, et cetera, residual emissions, a lot to handle here.
It is. And that's one of the challenges of the whole thing is that the whole system is so complicated. And we basically have to move forward on, 20 or 50 fronts simultaneously. One of the things that's led to is people arguing for these global solutions, things like a global carbon price or a U.S. carbon price as a way to address all of those sectors simultaneously. Interestingly, in California, we found that part of our carbon emission portfolio is probably the least effective, that the sectoral policies, the policies that are aimed at specific things, at transportation fuels, at electricity coming into the state, those have been much more effective. And so I think, we're going to have to just recognize that we're going to have to look at 20 different fronts simultaneously and deal with that.
So you're talking about, I think 350 million tons you got to take out of the air to get to neutral. Of that amount, how much will this negative emissions strategy take out? What number are we looking at here?
it looks like California is going to need about 100 million tons
Okay.
of removals each year. Today, we emit a little more than 400 million tons in total.
Okay. Okay. So in your report, you talk about the 3 pillars of negative emissions. Can you briefly describe each?
There's 3 different ways you can do this. We can rely on nature to continue doing the job that it's already doing. Trees in particular are an obvious way that carbon gets removed from the atmosphere and stays out of the atmosphere. Unfortunately, in California, our trees are actually pretty healthy and we can't make them grow a lot more than they are. Places like Tennessee and Maine, they deforested and they can grow their trees back, but we never did that in California. So natural solutions can be part of that 100 million, maybe 25 million. The second thing is that the far end is of the cost curve is building machines that just do this job for us. We call this direct air capture. And those machines physically remove CO2 from the air, but they're very expensive today. And so we probably want to use as little of those as we can. In between is a hybrid where you say, let nature do some of the work, like growing trees or growing almond shells, which are a source of carbon, 1 million tons of almond shells in the state a year, but keep that carbon from going back into the air by capturing it and permanently storing it, probably deep underground in geologic storage. It's very similar to oil fields.
Okay. Well, up next, we're going to have a more detailed discussion of each of those pillars for negative emissions and how well suited California is generally, and the San Joaquin Valley in particular, to implement that negative emission strategy. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Roger Aines with the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He's their chief energy scientist about an overlooked way to address climate change, carbon capture or negative emissions. So, Roger, I want to ask you, the first carbon reduction pillar is this thing called, natural solutions. You were mentioning a little earlier. How does nature help create negative emissions? What are some of the advantages and disadvantages? What's the cost and what's the impact? So, a lot to unpack there, but go ahead.
Well, you can imagine when a forest grows, it takes carbon dioxide out of the air and turns that into wood. And if we don't burn that forest down, that carbon stays out of the atmosphere for centuries. That's a great solution, creates an environment that we all want to live in. And it's a great and inexpensive way to remove carbon dioxide. Lots of other things improving of importance in California, wetlands, maintenance and improvement in wetlands. Also, the muck underneath a wetland is full of very carbon rich. So these are both ways to have a better environment and to remove carbon dioxide from the air.
You know, you also talk in this thing about the role of agriculture. Can you talk a little bit about that and soil storage?
Soil is always got a lot of carbon in it. Any farmer knows that a dark brown soil is a good soil, and that's because it has a lot of carbon in it. We've lost a lot of that carbon over the years from plowing those soils and not using cover crops. So returning to practices that maintains carbon rather than just using up the carbon will be very good for agriculture and good for the climate.
Yeah, it's also that you talk about reducing tillage.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, when you plow up soil and leave it exposed to the air, the carbon just evaporates out of it. It literally burns out of it. And so that's not something you want to do for any more than you have to. And cover crops and reduced tillage are extremely effective at minimizing that kind of loss.
Yeah, it's what you're really talking about here is land management practices, really a change in land management practices.
Exactly. And that's one thing that farmers are really delighted to pick up because they know that they make their money off healthy land.
Yeah. By the way, trees, not every tree is the same in terms of carbon capture. Can you briefly talk a little bit about that?
Well, we're very fortunate in that in California, we have redwoods, which are one of the best carbon capture schemes ever, because as a tree keeps getting bigger and bigger every year, it absorbs more carbon dioxide. That's not true of most forests. Most forests reach a point called senescence, where as they get older, they start dying as fast as they're being grown. And so the forest stops absorbing carbon, but not our redwoods.
Yeah. So it's, you like the big trees. The big trees, it's when they really start producing like 40 years out, they start really making a difference.
Exactly.
Let me ask you this. I understand there's a state has a 2030 Natural and Working Lands Climate Change Implementation Plan. What is it, and does it provide a roadmap for using nature to create negative emissions?
We're getting to the point where there's currently a draft plan that's out there for people to discuss. And it basically involves all the things that we just talked about: increasing soil carbon in agricultural land, preserving more land, basically addressing about 30% of our natural and working lands with a plan for how it's going to be better managed in the future. This is a big challenge, though, because today our natural and working lands are actually emitting carbon dioxide. They're not absorbing it. So we have to try and reverse that.
Yeah. We know let's go to the second pillar, because there's three. Go to the second one. The second one for negative emissions requires converting waste biomass to fuels and storing CO2. So what is biomass? Why is it important? What are some advantages and disadvantages? What's the cost? What's the impact?
Biomass is things like wood chips or sawdust left over from timber production, trash that we put into landfills, agricultural waste like almond shells. It's anything that was alive and now it's trash. Biomass doesn't have to be trash, but that's what we're talking about. And in California, there's an enormous amount of that most of it burns or allows its carbon dioxide to return to the air. And the idea is why? Why shouldn't we keep that out of the air permanently?
Yeah. Okay. Well, up next, we're going to talk about one of the more novel pillars for negative emissions. That's direct carbon capture, removing CO2 from the air and permanently storing it underground. Will it work? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. One of the negative emission strategies that perhaps has garnered the most public attention, frankly, some skepticism, is something called direct air capture. To many, the idea of a giant sucking sound seems a bit like the thing out of science fiction. But does it work? Is it cost effective? Could it have a discernible impact on reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? We're talking with Roger Aines. He is the Chief Energy Scientist at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. So Roger, let's discuss this direct air capture concept. It's kind of the final pillar of this negative emission strategy. How would it work? What are some of the advantages and disadvantages? What's the cost and what's the impact?
You listed a couple of questions there, and one of them was, does it work? Let's start with that. Yes, it does. These machines are operating in, about 20 places around the world to various sizes, and they're pulling CO2 out of the air. So that's the good news. It works.
Oh, okay, but let's follow up on some other things then. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages?
Well, an advantage is, I've struggled with this because a disadvantage is it's really expensive. You can buy this service from the Climeworks company in Zurich, Switzerland today for $1,000 a ton of CO2. Now, the current cap and trade price in California is something like $40 a ton. So
wow.
$1,000 a ton. And yet they're sold out. Why? Well, that's the advantage is it's such a straightforward issue. There's no uncertainty about it. You bought a ton removed from the atmosphere. They removed a ton. They ran it through their meter. You can see it happen. So the very simplicity of it is one of its great advantages.
It's very interesting. When you were talking about this, it made me think of the water crisis and desalination, which, when we talk about it, that's the most expensive way to get water. And I once was talking to someone about this, and they said, yeah, it's the most expensive way until you don't have any water. Then all of a sudden, it doesn't seem so expensive. So even though this is expensive, it is a possible solution. You're saying, what is the impact? How much could it actually take out of the atmosphere?
There's no limit. I mean, this could solve the problem for us, except it needs energy to run on, and it needs carbon-free energy to run on, or else you're just putting carbon back after you take it out. And so it's really the ability to build renewables to support this industry that is the limit. And in California right now, we're looking at using geothermal power in the Salton Sea to run these things so that we don't have to use our other renewable power in place.
Yeah, and reading your report, your geothermal is really the best approach to this, right? And it's the best energy source for this.
It is, because these machines use heat, and if you make electricity, then you have to turn it into heat. That's really inefficient. So why not start with heat?
Okay, so where's all this carbon going to go?
It has to go back where it came from. It has to go back underground. There's a lot of, we'd like to turn it into products. That'd be great. We can do some of that. We'd like it to go into our trees. We can do some of that. But the answer is we've spent 200 years putting trash in the atmosphere, and there's way too much. And the only place we can put it after we get it out is back underground where it came from.
What's the capacity? I would assume there's a lot of capacity underground. What's the capacity underground for underground storage?
It's nearly unlimited, particularly in the United States. Any place that has oil production, oil and CO2 underground are very similar. The CO2 turns into a liquid that looks a lot like oil.
I was reading that in your report. So after 3,000 feet, that really surprised me. The carbon actually turns into something like oil.
Yep, it turns into a liquid when you put it under enough pressure, and it'll stay in the rocks that held oil. So if we put it back in those rocks, we can expect it to stay there.
Yeah, and one of the issues, transitioning to the water issue, they have subsidence because when the water comes out, the land collapses. I assume the same argument could be made here. If you put the carbon back in, it liquefies, it fills that space, so you don't lose that I don't want to call it aquifer, that space, the storage space that was there to begin with. So we've got different things here. We've got forest biomass that comes from the northern part of the state. We've got ag biomass that comes from the San Joaquin Valley. And then we've got municipal solid waste. Well, that's the population, that's Southern California. So all that means we're going to have to transport that carbon somewhere to these underground storage locations. How are we going to do that?
It makes the Central Valley the focus of much of this work, because any place that's produced oil is likely to have the right rocks, and that's going to be the Central Valley. The rocks are pretty good all the way from above Sacramento down to Bakersfield. So that's where, frankly, things are going to start, is where we don't have to transport things. And then eventually we may decide to build pipelines to move the CO2, to move it around the state further than that.
Yeah, because I would see pipeline would seem to be the least expensive, rather, way to do that. Would be pipes.
Least expensive and slowest to build.
That's the other part of the equation. Well, let me ask you about that. What are some of the necessary systems and infrastructure you're going to need to make carbon capture a reality?
Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to get some wells going where we can inject the CO2 back into the old oil fields, or underneath the old oil fields, interestingly enough. And that's something that's never happened in California, but it has been done around the rest of the country and around the world safely. We've put 14 million tons of CO2 underground in other places than in the United States. But we need those first few wells just so that people in California can understand what this looks like and what it means to them.
Okay. Well, up next, we're going to talk about some of the regulatory and political hurdles that have to be cleared to make negative emissions and carbon capture a tool in the greenhouse reduction toolbox. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Roger Aines. He's the Chief Energy Scientist at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory about negative emissions, one possible technique to achieve California's goal of being carbon neutral by 2045. So I want to ask you, Roger, what are some of the key regulatory hurdles that need to be overcome to make carbon capture reality?
Well, there's the things below ground that we talked about earlier. We need to control the injection of CO2 into the ground so that it's done safely. I like to say that injecting CO2 underground is rather like building a 20-story building. It's something we do all the time after we have good regulations and we have schools that teach architecture and we have standards for materials. So we need to make sure that all of those things exist, which I believe they mainly do in the United States today. And now we have to make sure that they're enforced. That's upcoming, I think, as we start to test out all these things.
Yeah, I was reading in your report, I think it maybe captures kind of the essence of where you're coming from. It says the best geology may not coincide with the quickest legal stuff and permitting. I mean, they don't necessarily fit together sometimes.
No, they don't. And there's an enormous history of particularly power plants. Back in the day, remember coal-fired power plants? Remember those? Mm-hmm. They wanted to control the CO2 emissions by capturing the CO2 and putting it underground. And among a dozen other mistakes they made was all of them assumed that they could do it right underneath their power plant. Well, the geology is not perfect underneath most power plants. And so that's one of the reasons that it never happened, along with the fact that I think they didn't actually want to spend the money.
Yeah. Some in the environmental movement expressed some skepticism about carbon capture. There was a 2019 Stanford study, for example, that suggested that carbon capture would actually increase air pollution and would not be an efficient way to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. You've got last year, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council expressed some opposition to carbon capture projects. Could the lack of scientific and political consensus derail this carbon capture approach?
Well, I think we need to acknowledge that the concerns of the environmental justice community are real and that they're things that we need to take care of. That question about carbon capture increasing emissions, well, if you put carbon capture on those coal-fired power plants that I mentioned, you actually end up making more other kinds of pollutions like nitrous oxide. Well, that's not an outcome that any of us want. Fortunately, coal-fired power is on its way out the door, and carbon capture is not a rational way to treat it. But I think that we need to think about what the demands of large-scale industrial development are on any scale and how we're going to make good on the promises to all of our communities that the world can be a safe and clean place for them. Most of what is done today is kind of promises, and we need constraints on that. I call it guardrails. The state and communities need to place guardrails on how these projects might be developed. And it's very important to have a discussion about what those guardrails are. What are the benefits? We all know that climate's terrible and it's getting worse. We all know that we'd like to help. When you ask people, do you want to help? They say yes. And so the question becomes, how can communities help? What activities can they undertake that are going to meet their needs in terms of other things like environmental justice and environmental quality?
Well, environmental justice, I mean, it's more than simply, quote unquote, the environment, right? It's also jobs, for example. I mean, one of the things that's happening in Kern County with the transition from fossil fuels to renewables is a real concern there about the economic implications of that. And what I'm hearing you say is that this could possibly offer an alternative, certainly in terms of the environment, in terms of jobs as well.
Yeah, we foresee an evolution of the state's energy system from one that's based upon oil to one that can be based upon these kind of carbon management practices that we've talked about in the future. And frankly, Kern County is at the epicenter of that evolution. There's going to be a lot of new jobs in this carbon management area.
Yeah, and it's interesting, you know, the geological formations in Kern County are helpful. The work, and it's all been scoped out because they're doing that from their drilling for oil, but also the workforce is used to this kind of work. So you already have a trained, in some ways, trained workforce to handle this. So that seems to be kind of positive from an environmental justice standpoint as well.
Absolutely. I mean,
not to mention the air quality issues, right, which is also another huge issue in Kern County and the whole entire valley. Let me ask you this. So what's the bottom line cost of removing carbon using this method? What actions are you calling for specifically?
Well, we're saying let's integrate these systems. Let's look for win-win solutions where you get multiple benefits. So for instance, the idea of turning our trash into hydrogen and capturing the carbon. We get a clean fuel and we get the carbon removed permanently from the atmosphere. I think in the future, we should think about the cost of carbon management coming to around $100 a ton. Now, that's the technical cost. There's a lot of other issues associated with the transformation.
I apologize. We're running up against a hard deadline. There's so much to say. I really encourage people to read your report, though. I'm sorry for having to cut it short, Roger. Thank you so much for being with us today. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. See you next week.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.